You're live.
Good morning. Welcome to the Sports Betting Study Committee meeting, October 11th. Thank you all for being here this morning. I'd like to call the meeting to order. We have a guest speaker. James Pepper is the chair of the Cannabis Control Board, and he is here this morning to review the decisions that the Cannabis Control Board needed to make to bring the cannabis retail market from an illicit market to a legal market. We thought it would be really helpful to hear some of the lessons learned, some of the policy decisions the Cannabis Control Board needed to make, and then we'll have an opportunity to ask Chair Pepper questions. Chair Pepper, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Great to be here. My name is James Pepper. I'm the chair of the Vermont Cannabis Control Board. Mike, I have a PowerPoint that I'd like to share, and it's very brief, but I think I can kind of get through it quickly and then just open things up to questions. Just trying to see where the share screen option is. Oh, there it is. Got it. Sorry. Okay, is that Wendy? Is that showing up? Great. Okay.
Yes, it is.
Okay. As Wendy mentioned, so much of what we have to do at the Cannabis Board from a regulatory perspective is driven by the federal status of cannabis. So I just thought I had to briefly discuss at the outset some of the kind of history of cannabis. This will be brief. So cannabis federally is a Schedule I controlled substance. That means it has a high potential for abuse, and it has no currently accepted medical use in treatment in the United States pursuant to the Controlled Substance Act. This is the same categorization as things like heroin and LSD and methamphetamines. And so that means that while it can be legal at the state level, it is federally illegal. Here's just a very brief history of how the kind of legalization of cannabis has kind of rolled out across the United States. I highlighted in yellow the fact that almost every state has gone through a ballot initiative, as in the voters have demanded that the legislature legalize cannabis. Vermont was actually the very first state to legalize cannabis through a legislative process. We were followed very quickly by New York, Virginia, New Mexico, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. But we did this without the kind of support of a ballot initiative. We did have a 2014, what's known as the RAND report, which laid out a number of policy options for the legislature to consider when legalizing cannabis. I put this slide in here I think it's helpful considering the task in front of this committee to look at some of the options that could have happened on the cannabis front. And in fact, we did a lot of these early on prior to going to full commercial sales. And then just very briefly, here's the history of cannabis legalization in Vermont. We have medical cannabis in 2004. That was largely a patient caregiver home grow model. In 2011, the legislature permitted a number of medical dispensaries to open. In 2013, we decriminalized it, but it maintained civil penalties for simple possession. In 2017, Governor Scott established a advisory commission, mostly of his cabinet and key legislators, to consider cannabis commercial legalization. 2018, the legislature legalized home grow, first state in the country to do that legislatively. And then 2020, the legislature passed Act 164, which created the Cannabis Control Board. Here's just, meanwhile, a number of other states have passed medical marijuana programs. This is the current landscape across the United States. And this is permitted largely because of a 2013 memo from the Department of Justice that allowed states to pursue medical and adult use cannabis if state regulators followed certain guidelines. And if cannabis businesses and individuals followed state regulations with respect to these, they would be deprioritized for enforcement by federal prosecutors. These 8 principles were incorporated into something called the FinCEN guidance, which is directed at financial institutions, and it allows traditional banks to bank cannabis funds, not be in violation of the Banking Secrecy Act, if they follow these guidelines as well. In 2014 and in every subsequent budget since then, there's been an amendment called the Rohrabacher Amendment, which just directs it says that no Department of Justice funds can be used to prosecute states for medical marijuana. There's a corollary to this on the adult use side, which has not passed to date, but there's been a lot of support nationally for that. And then in 2018, Attorney General Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole memo. However, largely the kind of state of play with respect to kind of state regulations and federal kind of prioritization has remained the same. So looking at the Cannabis Control Board, we are a 3-member independent state agency in the executive branch that has the task of safely, equitably, and effectively implementing the laws around adult use and medical use. These are the 3 board members, myself as the chair, Kyle Harris, and Julie Holberg. This Act 164 went through, I think, at least 11 different committees. And I know a number of others, at least 5 others that I can count, were allowed to add language to it. That made for a little bit of a unwieldy bill. There's some areas that are somewhat contradictory. However, there are some things in it that are first of its kind and really a model for any rural state that is looking to legalize cannabis effectively and equitably. First, this is the vast majority of states find ways to stamp out what's called the legacy market. I say a legacy market as opposed to the illicit or black market. These are the people that have been growing illegally in Vermont, for the past 5 decades or longer, I should say. But the very key piece, almost the only time that the legislature actually wrote in a legislative intent into our bill, was saying that the goal in Vermont is to shift the current legacy market into a regulated space, as opposed to just replace it with big business, which is the path that the vast majority of other states have gone. And the other intent is to encourage participation by local small farmers. And the legislature gave us a very powerful tool to achieve this legislative intent. They said that we can consider the needs and risks of small cultivators, and we can make exceptions or accommodations to our rules in order to encourage them to participate. So, we had a number of priorities that we had to regulate and a number of rule-making authorities that we had to achieve, and we were allowed to waive some of these for small cultivators. Another very first of its kind, no other state has this. Each business is only allowed one of each license type, meaning that there will be no franchising in Vermont. You're not going to see, the Starbucks of cannabis, on every street corner. You're only allowed one license in one location. Another first of its kind in Vermont is how the legislature allowed the board to consider criminal history records. Part of the Cole memoranda is ensuring that no one who receives a cannabis license has certain types of criminal convictions, largely related to kind of money laundering or ties to criminal organizations or violent crimes. The legislature directed the board to consider whether an applicant presently poses a threat to public safety or the proper functioning of the market, and that nonviolent drug offenses shall not automatically disqualify an applicant. The board has probably, a lot of my staff has some deep understanding of how criminal history records are used in the criminal justice system and in employment. And we have kind of a very progressive view of, this kind of authorization that the legislature gave us on how to use criminal history records. I'm happy to discuss that. So early on, the board decided, we needed to build trust with the legacy market. The first thing we did was we invited some of the lead sponsors of Act 164 to the board. We had them walk through what the kind of core principles are. We established 7 core principles. We started going out and meeting people and talking to them. Our goal was really to develop the least regulatory intensive framework that achieved these core principles. And we worked with the legacy market for them to understand where we were coming from and the kind of core principles that we would never compromise. And then they helped us develop the kind of market structure that was in line with those goals. Of course, we always have to balance the Cole memorandum and just the resources of the board. We have a very limited staff. After we developed our rules, then we set about going through them with a fine-tooth comb and determining which ones we could waive for small cultivators. And currently we're just in a constant kind of public education mode. We have a very education first culture of compliance in our enforcement division. And, we're just spending as much time as we can creating guidance, communicating that guidance out to the field and meeting people where they're at and trying to help them understand the need for our regulations and how to comply with them. And then we are constantly monitoring this market as it develops. We have a number of rule revisions that we need to make and a number of statutes that we need to revisit this legislative session. Just a very brief overview. Since we were seated on April 19th, 2021, we've held 147 public meetings. That's 72 by the Cannabis Board. We have a 14-member advisory committee. They helped us develop a lot of our rules and regulations. They met 75 times with the board. We've had 2 banking roundtables aimed at encouraging financial institutions to bank cannabis funds. We've had 2 social equity town halls, 2 municipal roundtables that were hosted by the Vermont League. And then we've had 5 social equity networking events. And then I just have a list here, I won't read it, of just all a number of the witnesses that we heard to help develop our rules. And then just a very brief timeline, we were seated in April. We had our first meeting in May. We made our first 2 hires in July. We convened the advisory committee for the first time in August. We pre-filed our rules in November. They were adopted in March. The legislature approved our fee structure and we opened our licensing window. And, just this past October 1st, we had our first adult use sales. So I think this is the primary importance to this group. Some of the policy considerations that need to be kind of thought through before the market opens. A lot of these were resolved by the legislature over the course of the kind of 5 years or so that they debated this bill. But, fundamentally, are you going to have limited licenses, a cap on the number of licenses, or is it going to be more of an open market? There are plenty of pros and cons to each of these. The capped licensing system makes our regulatory burden so much easier. It's much easier for us as a cannabis board to regulate one, 50,000 square foot facility that's vertically integrated than it is 50,000 square foot facilities. We can ensure in a cap system that we have perfect geographic distribution. I think I've got some slides later on about price stability of cannabis and how it is very volatile under a uncapped system versus a capped system. And, the downsides of this, of course, is you cannot achieve that goal of shifting the illicit market into a regulated space if you're going to put a cap on the number of licenses. I mean, what most other states do is they say there's going to be a lottery. you have to have a perfect application even to qualify for the lottery. And then you have to pay, a licensing fee to get your lottery ticket. And, big companies can buy 100 tickets if they want, if they pay that licensing fee 100 times. It's just, you can set aside a certain percentage for social equity applicants. And I know that's a term a lot of people don't know. But in the cannabis world, social equity is a big portion of kind of what the market is trying to achieve. But, no matter what, with that, in the absence of banking and bank loans and financing, this market is very inaccessible, and to put a cap on licenses just makes it that much more inaccessible. Another key policy decision is the basic market structure. So what we did at the board was we asked our economists to estimate the size of the market, how much the demand was going to be, both between Vermonters and our neighboring states that maybe work or travel to Vermont regularly, and then our tourism market. We took the kind of demand, the cannabis demand, and we reverse engineered a market structure that would be, and we made it very unattractive to larger operators. We created a number of smaller tiers, and then we had larger tiers in case we needed them, but we just haven't opened them yet, and we don't intend to open the larger tiers. So our market is very much dominated by these small cultivators. Just by way of example, the largest tier that we have open, 15,000 square feet, would be a tier 3 out of 11 in Massachusetts. Our tier 1, our smallest tier, doesn't even meet the kind of, it's not even on the radar in Massachusetts. Just by way of example, their largest tier in Massachusetts is 100,000 square feet. We also, in response to kind of the illicit or the legacy markets kind of requests, we created a plant count alternative for outdoor cultivation. Essentially, people like to have unique growing patterns that include kind of rows of buffer crops in between their cannabis plants. So having a pure canopy-based, square foot-based tier was kind of bad practice for outdoor cultivators. So we kind of listened to the market. We also created a mixed tier where you have a certain portion of canopy indoors and a certain portion outdoors, so that outdoor cultivators can move inside during the winter and use their inside canopy. We kept our price per square foot of canopy very low for small cultivators, and then ratcheted it up progressively for the larger operators. So our price per square foot is actually lower than in, say Massachusetts or New York for smaller operators, but then it's higher compared to our neighbors for the larger tiers. Another key decision point was whether the cannabis board was going to be 100% fee supported, or whether we were going to get a portion of the excise tax to cover our operating expenses. Both our consultants and our and JFO independently came to the conclusion that trying to support the cannabis board budget strictly by fees that are generated by licensees would mean that our fees need to be astronomical and really only affordable to larger vertically integrated multi-state operators. And so we kind of we met halfway, where our larger tiers have a higher fee and our smaller tiers have a lower fee, and then the board would be supported in part by the excise tax. The tax rate in general is a very important consideration in cannabis, at least. There's always a dynamic tension between a regulated product and the illicit market, and people are really only willing to pay a certain premium for a tested, regulated product before they kind of just shift back to the illicit market. Obviously, every one of our regulations, whether it's around testing or packaging or labeling or, all of those add to the bottom line of the cost of regulated cannabis. And when you kind of then inflate that price again with an excise tax, a sales tax, a local option tax, you start to lose the kind of market capture that you're looking for on the regulated side. There's this is unique to kind of cannabis in Vermont, but there's also a 92% tax on vaping devices that was originally intended for jewels and nicotine-based products, but it does it's written broadly enough that it sweeps in cannabis. And so this 92% tax has meant that a lot of our product manufacturers have decided not to enter into the cannabis vaping space because no one, in their estimation, no one is willing to pay essentially, a 113% when you add in the sales tax, excise tax, local option tax, and this nicotine tax for a product. And so unless that changes, then I don't think that vapes will be very prevalent in the Vermont market. Local control, obviously we're a Dillon's Rule state. The legislature gets to decide how much authority the locals have in regulating the cannabis businesses independently. Tied into this is whether individual municipalities want to opt in or opt out. The default option in Vermont is that towns opt out or opted out until they opt in by a vote. And so, it's an important dynamic and an important decision point. And then also the legislature allowed the creation of local cannabis commissions that have some authority to ensure that cannabis operations are zoned appropriately, that they have all their local permits, and they can kind of be in charge of whether there's violations locally. And then, of course, advertising is just a difficult subject to deal with. When it comes to cannabis, advertising is a violation of the Controlled Substance Act. So, the First Amendment doesn't apply the way it does for other products when it comes to free speech and advertising. This is an area of great concern, both for the board, but also just when you're thinking about kind of all the lessons that we've learned from tobacco and alcohol over the years. We don't want to replicate any of those mistakes when it comes to advertising. So we have very strict advertising rules. A lot of them were laid out in statute, and then we've kind of further refined them by rule. I put counter marketing here. This is one of the lessons learned from Colorado. They said that it's really important to start, when it comes to cannabis, to start the messaging around youth prevention and education as early as you can. I mean, I know that a lot of people don't want to spend money until the revenue is starting to generate from sales, but they said that any chance you have to get ahead of the market with counter marketing aimed at youth, or when it comes to cannabis, mostly aimed at youth and kind of good consumption practices, safer consumption practices, the sooner the better. And then, let's see. So, a lot of our decision making around market structure and fees was kind of targeted at what our staff was going to look like. So we didn't have a staff in place when we proposed our market structure. We do now have the staff that you see before us. This staff is very lean, but they're very good at their jobs. Our compliance agents, almost to a T, have deep understanding of cannabis cultivation and agriculture and horticulture. They have been just a godsend to our licensees in kind of spotting issues early, making sure that these products are safe, making sure that they don't have kind of pests or mold or mildew on them, and really helping them kind of project the next stages of the supply chain. I think we're doing a good job with the staff we have, but I just would put out there that this is the kind of staff to licensee ratio in other states, and we fall kind of pretty far outside what's normal in other states. We're making do over here. And then the question is did our experiment work? Did we actually create a market where there was large entrepreneurial interest amongst the current small Vermont farmers and the current illicit market? I would say when you look at these numbers, you see that we have a very healthy start to the early market. So the annual demand is roughly 55,000 pounds. 70% of our cultivators are outdoor cultivators. These are people that, generally speaking, have a homestead or a existing farm, and they're diversifying their crop with cannabis. 79% of all of our licensees are these tier one small cultivators. I mean, that is a direct shift of the illicit market into the regulated space. That's something that you just don't see in other states. Again, no one has this 1,000 square foot tier. And to say that 79% of those 79% of the licensees are that tier one, it's a great achievement. However, it does create some uncertainty that I had kind of alluded to earlier. Is that, our harvest season is mid-October. There's some steps that need to occur, whether it's manufacturing or testing or curing, that happens after October. And the kind of main point here is this graph. You can see there's these green peaks. These represent harvest time of outdoor cultivators. And so, the gray line is the harvest times of indoor cultivators. And then you have these extreme peaks where you have a huge oversupply of cannabis at certain times of the year. And you can see this is the gray line on this graph is just the average demand for cannabis in the state. And then the blue line are the supply. So you have these great oversupply times during Vermont. We're going to see these oversupply moments in Vermont, which will lead to price volatility. And it will also lead to just backlogs in testing capacity and product manufacturing capacity. It's not as dramatic in year one because we're coming online and no one has gotten a full harvest season yet. And so really what we need to do is constantly be messaging out to our field, to our licensees about these out years, next fall, the fall after, and say, hey, listen, you're not necessarily going to have room at an extractor when you need it. You're not necessarily going to be able to get your product tested when you want to. You need to start thinking about storage, and you need to think about how you can do that safely without your product developing mold. And then on the product manufacturing side and the testing side, we're encouraging people to hire kind of temporary staff, whether that's graduate students for the testing labs or kind of temporary staff at the product manufacturing plants to meet this seasonal demand. So some of the just ongoing challenges that we face, some of these are unique to cannabis. Hopefully there's some overlap that you can find here, but banking and insurance continues to be a problem because of the federal status of cannabis. We've done a number of outreach events. I mentioned earlier, the banking industry helps shape our regulations around what information we collect, what information sharing that we can do about our licensees with these financial institutions so that they don't have to duplicate their compliance costs. So they've been great partners. And as a result, we've had 4 of our state chartered credit unions open their doors to cannabis accounts. And, prior to us doing these financial roundtables, there was only one who was willing to do it. So that's been a good partnership. Fire safety, they have done a tremendous job. They visited or reviewed every single one of our licenses. The reason I include them here, maybe this is unique to the cannabis industry, is that, when it comes to home-based cultivators, they're not subject, if they're not in a public building, they're not subject to fire safety. And so this is one of those areas where we're keeping a close eye on any issues that arise to people that fall kind of outside the scope of fire safety regulations. Social media, this ties right back into advertising. We're very concerned about the kind of falling into the same issues that we saw with tobacco and marketing to kids and marketing over consumption. The problem is, of course, is that the illicit market for a long time, the legacy market, they love social media. This is where they do the vast majority of their advertising currently, and they're just not used to being regulated in this way. So this is just an area where we're kind of very focused. There's a number of prohibited products. So the legislature, legalized cannabis, but they said certain things: no cannabis flower above 30% THC, no solid concentrates above 60% THC. This is one of those areas where there is a demand for these products, and if they're not being supplied on the regulated market, the illicit market will gladly supply them. I think it's probably very true of sports betting. I think that our belief at the Cannabis Board is that, prohibition does not end demand for a product, and we can do better on the regulated space and providing a tested, cleaner product. So this is just one of those areas that we focus on. The illicit market currently does provide delivery in Vermont. It's very easy to kind of go online and find someone who's willing to deliver cannabis to your door anywhere in Vermont. There's a lot of considerations around delivery, whether you're going to have kind of, essentially the gig economy, the Uber Eats model, where delivery operators go to a retail shop and pick up orders kind of on demand, or whether delivery operators can, have their own warehouse and buy wholesale and deliver to people, kind of more of the ice cream truck model. We are required to make a recommendation around delivery, and to the legislature. It's currently prohibited. We're trying to figure out what makes the most sense and talk to our partners and lessons learned around the kind of gig economy before we make a full recommendation. Special events, these are happening all over Vermont all the time. Again, they're not hard to find on social media. This is kind of on-site consumption at someone's at a wedding or at a brunch. This is something that I think that we could regulate in Vermont. Certainly, New York is going down the road of special event licensing. California currently allows for special events. I think the best analogy to think about is, about a cash bar at a wedding. You could have a cash bar for cannabis at a wedding as well, so long as you met some minimum standards around consumption, education, shielding from public view, transportation issues, insurance issues. You could get there. And then one of the most challenging aspects of our job currently is figuring out how to regulate hemp-derived cannabinoids. These are things like Delta 8, Delta 10, Delta 11. There's thousands of cannabinoids in the cannabis plant. There's a federal farm bill in 2018 that said, the difference between cannabis and hemp is the amount of THC. So as long as you're under a certain level of THC, it's considered a non-intoxicating legal product. And yet there's hundreds of cannabinoids that are intoxicating that kind of got swept into this legal status. And so now the Cannabis Board has to figure out, well, how do we ensure that safe, tested products are not, I should go the opposite way, that untested, unsafe, and intoxicating products aren't ending up in kind of gas stations and liquor stores. So, we have a report due on how to regulate hemp-derived cannabinoids later this year. With that, I'm happy to stop sharing and just answer any questions.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate the opportunity that you're giving us. We're really running up against time, so I know we're going to have questions for you. That's going to bleed in, Tucker, to a little bit of your presentation. Just as we think about the similarities and differences, right, with James's presentation and sort of helping us with the lessons learned from that legacy or illicit market to a legal market. The similarities are, I see that there was a state-by-state rollout of legalization, and obviously you're moving from a legacy market to a legal market. The main differences, of course, is that sports betting differs from cannabis in that cannabis is a controlled substance. it's also federally illegal. That's not the case for sports betting. And with what you are trying to do, you're talking about your market is made up primarily of the smaller local players, whereas in sports betting, we're talking about, national large corporations. So just sort of setting that up for the committee. James, what I heard from you too, that I think is worthy for us is you talked about having a least regulatory intensive framework. You talked about having flexible rulemaking. You said that the bill was a little unwieldy and that may be contradictory. I think that's something for us to think about. And you mentioned that the problem with prohibiting products is that the consequences that they stay in the illicit market. Those are some points that I heard, and I want to open up to the committee member, any members that had some questions for James about moving from a legacy market to legal market. Senator Sears.
I'll jump in. Thank you, Pepper, for the presentation. Very helpful. I'm sorry we've confused things in the legislature. But that was, we can always fix it, right?
I hate to even say that you confuse things because you gave us very clear principles. It's just sometimes there's contradictory elements to the law that cut against those principles. But what we've tried to do is really just say these are the places where we're not willing to compromise. But the market can help us develop the regulations that are in line with these principles. And I think that was a helpful moment for the kind of legacy market to realize. And I think that's why they really decided to shift into a regulated space. I know some of them are still waiting on the sidelines, seeing how this kind of early market shakes out. But to say that 79% of our licensees are these tier 1 small cultivators really means that Vermont has charted a different path than every other state. And I think that's really important when we think about the kind of federal legalization effort, because, Vermont has never really been able to compete on volume. We compete by having a craft product that's value added. And, the way to kind of drive innovation and diversification and have kind of craft products is to have a large number of small operators. And that's what we're seeing in Vermont. And it's really baking into our market a competitive advantage that I think will be a huge benefit to us when we, if and when we see federal legalization. And that's a direct result of the kind of principles that you embedded into the law. I mean, you were the one who said no big weed, in this state. And that message resonated throughout the bill.
Well, it came from a public hearing in Burlington, actually. So, it was an easier decision as a result of that. The people talked a lot about the Marlboro Man of weed, but I think in the sports betting world there are big players. One of my concerns is that when we go down the route of legalizing sports betting in Vermont, that we not limit it to one player or one company, that we have a variety of companies available. It may not be small craft groups, but there may actually be, some locals that want to participate. But I just want to make sure it's clear that I understand when you talked about the idea that we could have more than one group. I think that's what's important to me anyway, as we look at how state regulation would work. The other question I really have for you is in terms of the rules and how much I frequently get from the Administrative Rules Committee, the rules developed by a certain group or anything, and are they contrary to legislative intent? And it's usually a document this big, and you can see how big it is. And can you just help us a little with the rulemaking that you went through? And did we give you more direction? I know you've had other jobs in state government, and so can you compare the direction that the legislature gave you in terms of rules with other places?
Yeah, so the Act 164, which gave us the rulemaking authority, was about 120 pages long, and as I mentioned, it went through 11 different committees had possession over it, and I know at least four or
Well,
five.
at least 7 of them in the House.
Yeah, exactly. And the list of areas where we had to make rules was probably, I don't even know, 30 pages long. And so there was a lot of direction in there. Some were more specific than others. Some were kind of like you have to make rules around environmental conservation. Some were you have to ensure that every cannabis licensee has commercially reasonable levels of insurance. That has been a major sticking point for our smaller licensees that have never had insured products before, and they're growing 10 or 15 plants in their backyard, and their homeowners policy doesn't cover it. So there's areas where you were very prescriptive. There was areas where you were very general, but overall there was a list of about 100 different areas where we had to make rules. I think that was a result of the multiple committees, every committee having their own kind of say on it. But I think a point that Wendy made to us early on is, listen, every regulation, every report back, every regulation has to be enforced. You can't just kind of turn your blind eye to it. So you really need to weigh everything that you're doing with the amount of compliance and enforcement staff that you're going to have. So we had to kind of make some of these decisions in a vacuum because we didn't know what compliance and enforcement staff was going to be authorized by the legislature until after our rules had already been filed. But again, just to our first meeting, you were at it, Senator Sears, yep. Senator Pearson was there. A few members from the House were there. The lead sponsors told us what they wanted. It was consumer safety. It was social equity. It was shifting the legacy market into a regulated space. It was consumer protection. It was public safety. You told us what you wanted out of this bill, and so we tried to craft our regulatory framework to achieve those goals and nothing more. Not extra. So.
Thank you. Thanks, Pepper, very much. Appreciate the response. And this isn't for this committee, but I would suggest that at some point you put out something about the status of pardons in Vermont given the president's recent action, and I'm sure both pardons and expungement in Vermont might be helpful if people were aware of what we've already done and what happened with that. It's not for this committee, really.
Thanks, Senator Sears. Anyone else have questions or thoughts for James while he's here helping us with his insight? No questions for James? No? I have some questions.
All right.
So it looks like it took you, I was looking at the time frame for developing rules. You had from August to November is when you had that 3-month period where you came up with some rules. I think you said you pre-filed them in November and then they were adopted in March. So is that a total of 7 months, a 7-month period where that was the rulemaking?
Yes. I mean, depending on how it took us, we had to wait for our advisory committee to be seated because, the legislators almost thought, well, do we want a 3-member cannabis control board, or do we want this 14-member advisory committee having all of the authority? And so we really didn't want to move before the advisory committee was seated. These are 14 people, mostly of either the cabinet or people that have experience in things like criminal justice reform, public health, public safety, women and minority-owned businesses, all the regulatory frameworks. We didn't want to move without them. And so we had to wait until, I think, August until they were finally seated. But as soon as they were seated, we had 75 meetings with them, developing every aspect of our rules over the course of 2 months. Each one of those were public meetings. We got public input at each of them. And then we had a draft ready for of our 4 administrative rules by, I think, early November. We put them out for public comment. And then we had these marathon public comment sessions. And then, we had to address each public comment individually. So we had these marathon meetings where we were addressing each public comment individually. And then we pre-filed in, I think, November 29th, and then they were adopted in March. So, I think September is when we really started to work with our advisory committee. And then, March is when the rules were finally promulgated and adopted.
Mm-hmm. So you talk a lot about, sort of the flexibility of rulemaking and the value of having in the statute, the intent and the principles. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, the pros and cons of, it sounds like your bill was, as you call, a little unwieldy, and that's no disrespect to the process. Right. It's just, obviously it's a conversation that's been going on for years and years, which is much like sports betting. So maybe give a little insight as to what are the things that you think need to be in statute versus what are the things that can be delegated to the authority, the Cannabis Control Board, the regulatory authority.
Yeah, well, so this reasonably commercial, the kind of commercially reasonable levels of insurance is a great example of, it's written into statute. Every licensee must maintain commercially reasonable levels of insurance. Well, there are no insurance carriers except there's one in California. The rest of them are these kind of non-admitted surplus line insurers, and they can charge what they want. They can have exclusions that other insurance policies wouldn't be allowed to have. And, when you think about the vast majority of our licensees being these home-based, kind of small 1,000 square foot cultivators, this is a barrier to entry that a lot of them can't afford. What we did, we said you could self-insure. So you can set aside in escrow a certain amount of money. If you can demonstrate good faith at getting insurance and saying that it's just way too expensive, because it is expensive, you can set aside a certain portion of money to cover any claims against your business. But we can't waive that regulation, and it's been a challenge because it's in statute. It's one example, but it also helps us understand where the legislature wants us to go. Any small business should have insurance, and it's nice to hear. It's reaffirming for us when we create a regulation that it was intended by the legislature. So hearing their intent is very helpful. I just when you make it too prescriptive, right, it's not going to cover all of the various scenarios that we see playing out, when we actually start reviewing applications.
And I wonder if some of that is intent and goals, right, and principles work. I hear you say that, maybe it's when you start to get into prescribing operational decisions. I can share just in terms of the insurance liability. We are hearing right now that the bars and restaurants are having a challenging time getting liquor liability insurance. So if that were something that was mandated, which is not in statute or regulations, we would be facing the same difficulty that your small players are if that were in statute. So that might be something for the committee to think about, is what ends up being in statute versus giving the administrative authority the ability to navigate and make decisions on. I'm going to open it up again. If anyone has any other questions, I don't want to dominate the conversation or ask all the questions. Does anyone else have any questions for James? So James, I have one more question then. Sure. How much did you consider the regulatory framework or what other states had set up, neighboring states, when you were looking at setting up the regulatory framework for retail cannabis?
That was every decision point was through the lens of, we had comparison analyses. We were allowed to hire a consultant, and so we hired a consultant that led our advisory committee. We divided them up into subcommittees: public health, market structure, social equity, et cetera. Every decision, these are all folks that have no background in cannabis. And frankly, the board members don't have a huge background in cannabis policy either, including myself. So, these subcommittees met 6 times a day, twice a week. What was going on is our consultants put decision points in front of them with comparison charts from every other state. So, like, for instance, our health warning, Dr. Levine was on our public health subcommittee along with Ingrid Jonas and a few others. And they looked at the health warnings of all of our neighbors first, because we wanted a sort of regional feel to the health warning and the THC symbol. And then, they just looked at every other health warning and what was effective, what was not effective, if there's any lessons learned that we could ascertain from the other states that had these things. And then they came up with what they thought kind of fit the Vermont need. And so I would say just about every decision point was through the lens of looking at a comparison chart of what every other state has done.
Great. Well, we really appreciate your time, Chair Pepper. I don't think if there's no more questions, we thank you and have a great day.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Wendy.
Appreciate your time.
See you.
Okay, Tucker, you are going to give us a presentation of our next decision point, which is the establishing the administrative authority.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Tucker Anderson from the Office of Legislative Counsel. The committee had asked me to kind of brief 3 discrete decision points today, all under the umbrella of administrative authority, which you just got a great comparison with the Cannabis Control Board. The 3 discrete areas that I've been asked to talk about are, first, whether the administrative authority within the sports betting market is going to be centralized or decentralized. Second, what is the balance between statute versus administrative rules, which you started to dive into a bit just a few minutes ago. And finally, does the model that you decided on in your last meeting require the creation of some new administrative structures, or are you going to rely on existing administrative structures? So an example of that, of course, is that the Cannabis Control Board is an example of where a new structure was created for the regulated market that was created by the legislature. So the first decision, is this going to be a centralized or decentralized model? And the basic question is going to be, is there going to be one agency to rule them all? Or are you going to establish discrete authority within a series of administrative agencies that have expertise in specific areas? And the reason I highlighted this during the initial presentation, and if you go back and you want a visual aid, by the way, this is on page 9 of the very first presentation that I put together for you all. The reason that I highlighted the centralized versus decentralized question is that when the Senate was working on a sports wagering proposal in the spring, one of the issues that came up is whether in the specific bill they were working on, whether the Department of Liquor and Lottery should be, for example, the resource for persons experiencing problem gambling. So should a person who needs assistance and resources have to go to the agency that is actually operating the market, offering the product in order to get help with their problem gambling? That was a flag that was thrown up during those discussions. So if you are going to have one agency that handles everything, what is that agency going to be? Who is going to be in charge? And what is the scope of their responsibilities and duties with respect to the three major parties here. The first is the state and its interests. The second is the operator or operators in the market. And finally, the consumer. And are you going to separate out how the state agencies are interacting with each one of those major players? The example that I wrote down here is you have fantasy sports contests that are currently operating in Vermont. And under that statutory structure, you have two administrative agencies playing separate roles. You have the Secretary of State that handles the registration of the fantasy sports contest operators. And then you have the Office of the Attorney General, which is handling enforcement and rulemaking with respect to those fantasy sports contests. So there's an example where the state made the decision, we're going to have two agencies handling different discrete aspects of how operators and consumers are interacting with this market. If you go the route of having a decentralized model where you have authority broken up between multiple agencies, all performing discrete roles, you're going to think about where the specialization of those administrative agencies lies. So, the example that I brought up first from the Senate's work in the spring, the decision was made in that specific proposal to have the Department of Mental Health be the agency that is responsible for two aspects of the regulated market. First, handling services for persons who are experiencing problem gambling and need resources. And second, for auditing how the state is carrying out its responsible gambling or responsible gaming programs. So that was another kind of piece of oversight that was taken away from the central administrative agency and put off to an expert agency for purposes of kind of separating interests. So that is that decision point teed up for you all. Commissioner Knight, would you like me to move on to the second big piece?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you, Tucker.
So the next big piece, and this is a bigger discussion than the last one, and will likely not be resolved until you actually start working on your recommended bill draft. And that is, what is the balance between statute and administrative rules going to be? To tee up the issues, just as a small example, will the competitive bidding process be completely established in statute? During your last meeting, you decided that your recommendation was going to be for a controlled market with a bidding process. So is that something that's going to be spelled out in the statute? I can send you some examples. New York did have statutory requirements for how the process was carried out. And then there was a balanced approach with rulemaking that allowed the agency to kind of fill in the details. How much of this market and the requirements, for example, for the operators, is going to be in statute? Is this going to be a situation where statute spells out minimum standards for each of the major categories? Security, requirements for financial competency, regular audits, reports. You can really get into detail in the statute. Alternatively, you can meet the minimum constitutional standards, which is to build the canal and let the administrative agency, the regulatory authority of the administrative agency flow through the canal. Second, what are the regulations going to be formed as? And the chair brought this up with James Pepper. The Administrative Procedures Act tees up two separate forms of regulations that can be adopted. So the one that is primarily known, rules. The APA rulemaking process, excuse me.
Love those dogs.
They just want to be helpful. They're really nervous about the moose that has been traipsing by the house every day. So I apologize for the record. The APA tees up a standard timeline for the adoption of rules. And these are supposed to be regulations adopted when they concern or impact, for example, the private market or other aspects of state government, where there is some enforcement authority that is going to be carried out. Typically, that sort of regulation is adopted as a rule. And under the Administrative Procedures Act, the fastest practical timeline for that is likely 85 days. And that's if literally every second is saved in the process. You heard some of the timing issues discussed a moment ago. The other type of regulation that can be adopted under the Administrative Procedures Act is a guideline. And guidelines are typically adopted by an administrative agency to guide the agency's own actions. And there are two types of guidelines that are covered by the Administrative Procedures Act. The first, I would say, is a guideline that is publicly posted that can be used as a legal document for purposes of enforcement or for judicial notice. And an example of this would be the guidelines that are adopted by the Department of Liquor and Lottery for the lottery system. The second is an unenforceable guideline. And those are those that are not indexed, posted, that don't go through a formal process and cannot be used for judicial enforcement. The proposal that the Senate was working on in the spring allowed the Department of Liquor and Lottery to adopt the competitive bidding guidelines as APA guidelines. And that was to save as much time as possible, because the primary concern that was discussed at that point was speed to market. How quickly can the regulated market be stood up in time for the coming year? If that is still a consideration for this committee, you may want to hear more about the Administrative Procedures Act and the different timelines for guidelines and rules, and how much can be embedded in as a guideline, whereas you might have to wait longer for certain aspects of the regulated market if they're going to be adopted as rules and have that kind of outward effect on the market as far as regulatory enforcement goes. All right, the third and final discrete decision point here is whether your regulated market is going to require the creation of a new administrative structure, or whether you're going to leverage existing structures. In my time working on this issue with the legislature has considered both. So there was a bill from, I believe, 4 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, and that was from Senator Sears and Senator Sorokin, that proposed a license-based market and the creation of a sports wagering division within the Department of Liquor and Lottery that was going to oversee the market. More recently, I have seen proposals to instead have the department in its current form with no new unit handle the launch of the market. There's really not a deeper dive that has to happen there. It's really a discussion and consideration for all of you, and I guess discussion with the commissioner about what the capacity of the administrative agencies are. Mm-hmm. Again, this third decision point might rely in part on how many agencies are going to be involved in the market, right? The first question. Mm-hmm. If this is going to be decentralized and you're going to have a lot of agencies handling discrete aspects, maybe you don't need to create a new structure. But if you're going to embed all of this within a single, either new or existing administrative authority, are you going to have to add staff, add units, kind of create this new regulatory authority that is going to be handling everything from contracting with the operators all the way through to auditing financial statements, monitoring security, and collecting the revenue share or the taxes. And before I stop, the final thing here is that some of your considerations are going to depend on whether you're going to include retail wagering. And I know that's something that still has not been decided by the committee, but I wanted to note that some of these administrative decisions that you'll be making will be impacted by whether or not you're going to need boots on the ground going to retail locations, and how robust of an enforcement division you might need if you're going to have a retail market in the state.
Thank you, Tucker. So maybe we could look at the centralized versus decentralized administrative authority and then existing versus new. I think you make a valid point, Tucker, that, I think we want to talk conceptually about balancing the statute versus administrative rules, but until we understand, I think there's more discussion on that, and we can save that for another kind of decision point. I'd like to open it up to see if anyone had questions or thoughts. Any questions for Tucker? Any thoughts on what we've heard? Any sense of where your preference is in terms of some of those key points that we need to discuss and recommend?
Can I just take a thought for a walk?
Of course.
Cool. So where we're heading right now, the direction is, we discussed last week to utilize the lottery department. And then, so within what we're talking about here with the legislative structure, new legislative structure, or use existing, I guess my question is for Tucker, what's the header on that if we're using the existing infrastructure within the department, keeping it control, going to licensing, but we were theoretically to utilize the agency to continue this sort of, I guess, centralized, if I'm using the word correctly or incorrectly, correct me. I guess sort of how are we articulating this as a structure kind of leading in that direction, just because that's the first space my head was brought to. Did that make any sense?
It made some sense. I went on the walk with you and started jotting down some quick notes. Within the structure that you've chosen, right, the control model, the state is playing a really active role, but it perhaps has less monitoring responsibility than in states where, and I'll bring you the example from the CCB that you just heard. You have, a few 50,000 foot cultivators versus 51,000 foot cultivators. Within the model you've chosen, it benefits having at least primary agency, right? The agency that is overseeing the franchise and the contract, having a direct relationship with your agents in the market, regardless of how many there are. Where you may find issues with having a primary licensee is in the agency's capacity to oversee each one of the discrete elements. Mm-hmm. You have an example in your current control state model for liquor, where you have the Department of Liquor and Lottery profiting from spirits, and then you have another market that is privatized but is being overseen by DLL, and you have taxes being collected on various forms of the sale, for example, of malt beverages and vinous beverages. So there's another party that's being included there, right? Which is tax. So thinking about centralized versus decentralized and giving you the header, the question is, are you going to choose a primary authority to handle most, if not all, of the relationship with the actors in the market? Once you've made that decision, are you going to need to decentralize certain aspects? Right? So the example I brought up was the decision the Senate made in the spring. We're going to take out the responsible gaming aspects and put them under the Department of Mental Health. And that was more of, less of a legal decision than it was a policy decision. And the policy decision was that the consumer who needs these resources from the state should get them from kind of an independent state authority, not the authority that is involved in actually offering the product to the public. I hope that my walk helped you there.
We seem to have a habit of doing this to each other. So basically what you're saying is you could do centralized control with a primary authority, but then they could choose to offload aspects to other folks as they deem necessary.
Yes, and I will do my job slightly better now and give you an example, concrete, of what another state did. Connecticut. Connecticut is one of those states that is listed in the report as a control state for the following reason. You can only offer sports wagering in Connecticut if you are the Connecticut Lottery Commission or one of two tribal entities with a casino in the state. Now, because the Connecticut Lottery Commission is an actor in the space, they're not just necessarily contracting with other parties, they're offering at retail locations, retail wagering in Connecticut. And because they have a competitor in the market that is another sovereign entity, which would be the tribes in the state, the rules that were adopted to guide the market were not adopted by the Connecticut Lottery Commission. They were adopted by the Consumer Protection Division within the Attorney General's office. So that was a decision that the legislature made in Connecticut to say, because we as a state are acting as a competitor in this market, we should have some detachment and move some of this, rule setting, aka the rules for the game that's going to be played in the competitive market, away from the player. You don't have that decision yet in what you're kind of crafting before you, but that's an example of where they decentralized some of the regulatory authority away from the primary actor, the Connecticut Lottery Commission, and moved it away to kind of get that a slightly more independent actor involved.
More questions for Tucker or thoughts about the centralized versus decentralized administrative authority? And what I heard you say, Matt, was that one of our state interests that we've articulated is that we give, where is that? Flexibility. We want to make our administrative authority strong and responsive. So obviously we want to keep that in mind on when we're looking at whether to centralize or decentralize. I will give you a little snapshot, and Tucker alluded to it, in terms of how it works right now in the Vermont Department of Liquor and Lottery for lottery and liquor. So Tucker talked about those three kind of audiences or three interests, right? We have the state interest, we have the operators, or in our cases would be the agents or licensees, and then the consumers. And so right now the regulatory framework for liquor and lottery is that we have all of those aspects covered within the Department of Liquor and Lottery, right? So the state's interest is in selling responsibly distilled spirits and lottery tickets to raise revenue for the state. So that's part of our mission. Then, of course, we're interfacing with the lottery agents, the liquor agents, and the licensees through a regulatory structure and then a contract. So when we license all of the agents, we license all of the businesses that are serving and selling alcohol. And then we do a contract arrangement, a competitive bid process with the liquor agencies. And then on the consumer side, because we have an enforcement team, right? So we're making sure that minors aren't served, alcohol, they don't have access to alcohol, tobacco, and all our rules, the regulations that we have in place are designed to serve the other public safety mission that we have. So just as a framework of how the agency is structured now with our regulatory products. Any other questions? You're awful quiet today. So, Senator Steers.
I have a couple of comments and questions, but one of them is, it seems to me that the issue of problem gaming, it's kind of a no-brainer that we go to either the Department of Health or Mental Health. I don't know which, but with liquor and lottery, liquor, we already do that with the Department of Health with the liquor. And with I think it's a contract with Howard Mental Health on the lottery side. But it seems like to me that the differences between Vermont and Connecticut, the differences between Vermont in itself in terms of liquor stores, I can go to 13 liquor stores, are probably more than that. Go to a number of liquor stores and buy spirits. I can go to a number of stores and buy wine, beer, etc. I can also buy lottery tickets at a number of places. But the decision we have to make, I think it would be fundamental to whether you have a separate division or not, is where can I go buy my, and I hate to use the term buy my bets. So would I go to my phone? Or would I go to the liquor store, or would I go to the, lottery store? And I think that's the fundamental decision to me. Would lead, if it's going to be by phone or, electronically that I'm going to be gaming, and making these bets, then seems like there needs to be a separate division within the Department of Liquor and Lottery. Just for enforcement, because it's all going to be done by individual person's phone. I don't know how you know if the person's over 18 or not, or 21 or whatever the one is.
Yeah, I think the way the operators described it is there's ways to put filters and blocks in the system, right? So that I think that some of this, and this is what the question I had with Pepper, is some of the operational market structures are going to be in place to help us so that they don't have to be in statute, because the way the gaming system works with the operators is the phone itself is going to, prevent people from buying certain products if we want to prohibit them or being a certain age. The first part of what I heard you say, Senator Sears, is that you're feeling that it's obvious that for at least the problem gambling and responsible gaming, that should be a separate administrative agency. Yeah. Are you feeling the same as Matt? Is that there should be one primary administrative authority for the sports betting, and that might be the Department of Liquor and Lottery, except for the problem gambling and responsible gaming, which could be the Department of Health?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay. So I feel like that's a fundamental question that we're driving at right now. And I would like to understand if the rest of the committee agrees that we're recommending a centralized administrative authority, with the primary administrative authority being the Department of Liquor and Lottery, with the exception that the sports betting and responsible gaming needs to lie with another agency, and that would be the Department of Health or the Department of Mental Health. Does that make sense? Tate.
Yeah, Chairwoman Knight, I would agree to that. Yes.
Any other thoughts about whether we're in agreement with that, or that makes sense to everybody?
It sounds okay to me.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, that feels like a direction that makes sense. To your point, Senator Sears, now we talk about sort of whether there's an existing structure that we use or we have a new administrative structure. I think, and Tucker, you raised this earlier, the answer to that is going to depend in part on whether we're recommending only online gaming or we're recommending, a retail market. So let's just, since we haven't made that decision yet, let's just go down the hypothetical. And maybe I can give you a little background, and Tucker, you can weigh in on this, is what I understand from the other states, because we've been doing a lot of evaluation with other states in terms of how they set it up. They have, New Hampshire, for example, in New York, they have a director of sports betting, because a lot of the way they've set it up is through a contract, right? So they are not doing their own lottery app like DC did. It's a contractual relationship. So the resources on the administrative agency are not as great, because you're establishing that through a competitive bid process and a contract. So New Hampshire has a director of sports betting, which we'll hear from. New York has a director of sports betting. And for all of New York, they have one person who's the director of sports betting. I think that one will hear from the operators as we move along. Again, if we're just talking about if we're just talking about online gaming and doing it through the franchise contract relationship, which we talked about, I think the need to have an existing a new administrative structure are less. I think that you have to look at, if you're going to make this a retail market, is that going to require a new administrative agency? The point I will make there is that we already have right now 582 lottery agents that the department license and regulates. And if we were to add a retail sports betting, that could potentially be another service that the lottery agents are offering. So I wonder if there's, again, a need for an existing, a new administrative structure. I will say that when you look at the Cannabis Control Board, they opted to set up a brand new administrative structure. As the commissioner of a department that authorizes or that has regulatory authority for controlled substances, it often appears to us that they have set up a whole redundant system, right? So you have liquor and lottery that's responsible for, how many years, 80 years of regulating controlled substances. I know there are certain reasons why they did that, but there are some competing points of view on that as well. So I think on existing versus a new administrative structure, it feels like we need to answer the question of whether or not we're recommending retail or online or both. Any thoughts on that?
Oh,
What's that?
no, I was just kind of mumbling a little bit. Apologies. Sensitive
Okay.
microphone.
It's okay. Okay, Matt.
No, just could you frame that question one more time? I was just trying to.
So what I guess so we're looking at, we've already established, I think, that we really need more conversations about whether or not what goes into statute versus what goes into administrative rule. And Tucker talked about having more discussion about guidelines versus rulemaking. And I think we need further discussion for that to help us understand. I think the point there is to understand speed to market. So one of the reasons why Senate Economic Development, when they were looking at and sort of talking through a bill, was they opted to have guidelines, gave the agency, the Department of Liquor and Lottery guidelines to adopt the competitive bidding and et cetera, was speed to market. And so if we think speed to market is still a consideration, then I think that comes into play as to whether or not we are recommending rulemaking or guidelines. I think that's for a further discussion is what I'm hearing from Tucker, and I agree. And I think that's one question. Should we have a further conversation about the statute administrative rule guidelines before we make that decision? Does that make sense to push that decision off?
I think it does.
Okay. So then the other point would be on the existing versus a new administrative structures. We have not yet decided whether to recommend only online gaming, retail, or both. I think that those questions need to be addressed first before we can then really understand whether or not we want to recommend existing administrative structure or a new administrative structure. To Senator Sears's point, you know, do we need additional new division? Or if we're going to have the Department of Liquor and Lottery, which we've established as being the primary regulatory agency, can they add the resources necessary to stand up to sports betting with their existing infrastructure and add a few more, staff members, for example? So it feels like we need to address retail versus online decision before we talk about existing versus a new administrative structures. Does that make sense?
Yes. So on the speed to market question, I guess we haven't asked ourselves this question as a committee yet, is what would this committee's goal to going live, right? As far as looking at a calendar. I mean, if this does pass next session, that's like a July 1 probably implementation date of everything. I mean, are we theoretically, best case scenario, saying up and running kickoff football season next year? I mean, if we're taking a look at how quick we're going to do this, why don't we set a theoretical target to aim for?
Yeah, I think the research has shown that obviously the prime sports betting time begins in the fall with NFL. And then certainly as we move into the holidays, we have the Super Bowl and all of the playoff games that lead up to that, correct?
Yeah, and then college is big. College football,
Correct.
College basketball is also big.
Correct.
Gaming buckets. So
right. So if we're looking at, the reality is the legislature is going to convene in January. Like you say, they could implement something. One of the things we talked about last year was having the bill be effective upon passage and not have it be effective July 1st. Mm-hmm. So there's an option to recommend that it's effective upon passage, which might get you May. And then if you're talking about, we had estimated, a 6 month time frame. I think that's why the committee ended up going down the guideline time frame and not the rulemaking. So that is something to consider if we're interested in having this next year with the time frame. Those are important considerations. And I think the other thing to consider as we talk about retail versus online is how much more time is it going to take to set up a retail market? You look at what Cannabis Control Board, where they're literally setting up a retail bricks and mortar market. I think that comes into play as well. And is there going to be a recommendation for some sort of staggered, do we start with online gaming and then evaluate to go to a retail market? Do we take it in phases? Tate?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I would be open to both the mobile and the retail, and could certainly understand if there was a staggered approach. I just was doing a quick Google search here to get a better understanding, especially when talking about seniors, how many seniors own mobile phones. If we're just looking online, and I can paste it in the chat section here, but just this is just something I found from Pew, and it looks like, you know, folks who are 65 and older, 39% do not own a smartphone. So, you know, we're looking at this. I think that's, you know, something we need to consider.
I would agree that we start with online and then evaluate or have further study of how to implement a retail sites, because the problem is we do have a number of places, but we don't have the casino or the kiosk, the off-track betting, those types of places that are already, the infrastructure is already there. I think that's what New York, Connecticut, and some of the other states have taken. I think Connecticut, if I'm not mistaken, has off-track betting, which is a place where
yeah, Senator Sears, we're gonna, I think, we do have the Connecticut Lottery, a representative that's gonna come talk in a week or two. So I think that's, I think it's actually the meeting we talked about discussing online versus retail market. Okay, I feel like I need to perhaps give the committee some information from as the Commissioner of Department of Liquor and Lottery to talk a little bit about the administrative capacity for that might help you understand whether or not we need an existing or a new infrastructure, or whether we're recommending that. So I think for next time, I'll be prepared to give you information on that. We are going to talk about retail versus online. And maybe what I'm hearing is we need to hear from Connecticut to see how they did it. And we're still considering both, and maybe it's staggered, but I think more on that. Any other thoughts or questions or follow-up? I feel like we're reaching a good point today. But we have a half hour left. I know we'd all be happy for that half hour back, but as homework for any of us for next time, or other thoughts or questions about what we talked about today in terms of administrative authority, should we take the time to chat about that a little before we head off? Okay, I'm going to take the silence as you're all set. I have some homework to do. Tucker, I really appreciate you. Oh, wait. What's that? Oh, okay. All right. Would you mind asking me to hang on to the Zoom? Okay, so Mike wants you to hang on after we end this meeting so he can explain emails about the public hearing. So I think this concludes the sports betting study committee meeting. Meeting is adjourned.